been held in your hands from the moment that I wake up until I lay my head. I will sing of the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. I love your voice. You have led me through the fire in darkest night. You are close like no other. I've known you as a father. I've known you as a friend. I have lived in the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With my life laid down, I surrender now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. I will sing of the goodness of God.
Okay. Some technical changes, and you'll be able to see the information there as we go. I had, let me see if this loads up here, some requests between when we ended last night and now to speak a bit about, well, if the land, as I've presented it so far, it's rather scrappy compared to some of the other lands in the area, what's all this business about milk and honey that shows up? I know some of you have asked, and Chris has asked as well. So I want to start by saying a few things about that. Chris, this isn't loading. What do I do? Yeah. Should I do it again? Oh, there it is.
You got it? Okay.
Now it's up. Okay. Now it's up. So I'll show a few pictures and read one of several places in the Old Testament that mentions milk and honey. I think the verse is up here, Exodus chapter 3, verse 8. The phrase shows up as well in the book of Deuteronomy when Israel is ready to enter the land, but already when they're still in Egypt, before any of the plagues take place, when they're all not quite sure if they're moving out or not, some of them. We have God speaking to Moses when he's in the Sinai, meeting God face to burning bush face. Yeah, you know the story. And God said to Moses at the burning bush, so I have come down to deliver my people from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them up from that land to and now the land into which they're going to enter is described this way, a good land. A good land. First of all, nowadays, in English, good is the word that is somewhere less than excellent, but better than average, right? Like a B plus kind of a thing back in school, right? And you'd rather say, what about an excellent land, a good land? Actually, the word here, the Hebrew word tov, is the word that is used in the book of Genesis chapter 1 on multiple occasions to describe what land? The land of Eden. God said, and it was, and he called it good. So whenever you see the land described as good in the Old Testament, I think the default sort of conclusion, at least to start thinking about, is it's a reference. We're taking you back to life the way it's supposed to be and trying to get you as a person back in a way that's suitable to live in the land the way it was supposed to be before the fall. Because people are rascals as well. It fits the land, which is rather scrappy. But both of them are going to be redeemed, eventually. So a good land, a spacious land, and then the phrase, a land flowing with milk and honey. To the place of the Canaanite, Hittite, Amorite, Perizzite, Hivite, Jebusite. And he could have listed a few more as well, but people already living there of various kinds. The phrase is a land flowing with milk and honey. And the tendency of Bible readers today, as it has been for millennia, is to read that phrase, milk and honey, as all that good stuff. If you want modern equivalencies, you could say gold and silver, stocks and bonds, padded pews and air conditioning, all those things that we would tend to associate with life, really nice and comfortably. The question is, for people actually living in the land of Canaan, becoming the land of Israel, what was it actually like? How accurate is that? Is this a hoped-for, down the road, sort of end times description, or is it one that actually fits something about the land specifically? And I think the latter, actually. Here's a map that shows the land, that shows rainfall and elevation. The darker the color, the dark blue-purple going down to kind of the light green, the heavier the rainfall. And then as you move to yellow and orange, the less the rainfall. And I mentioned a little bit about rainfall last time. You can see there's an orange line that runs, it kind of comes off the top right, and then runs down toward the Dead Sea. It makes a loop north of the Dead Sea, the Jordan River Valley, and then comes back down south again and works its way over toward the coast. You can see that red line on the map. This is the 12-inch rainfall line. I mentioned yesterday that you need 12 inches of rainfall. You need 12 inches of rainfall guaranteed every year in order to settle down, be permanently in one spot with crops, wheat and barley, and then other things eventually able to plant orchard trees, pomegranates and grapevines and figs and all of this. In order to live, you need that much rainfall or the dew equivalent to sustain settled life. And anything beyond that, that is to say on this map in the orange area, east and south, it's going to be a different economy, a different lifestyle, specifically sheep and goats instead. And the land, you can see, is divided between those two basic living zones. They're quite close to each other. You can actually almost see the line on the ground when we're there, where the one gives way to the other. And certainly the line of permanent historic settlement that's right on that line. Anything beyond it, sheep and goat land. Anything behind you, more settlement. So that's an important line. And you can see how close Jerusalem is to that line, just to the left of the Dead Sea, how close Jerusalem is to that line. And the land of Judah, itself, the heartland of the biblical story, straddles that line, where half or more than half of the land of Judah is below the 12-inch line, and part of it is above. This is a picture. Here it is. This is a picture of that line. You can see the town, Palestinian Arab town, in the front. You can see green, a little bit of growth, some plowed fields, and some olive trees. And very quickly behind it is the shepherd land, where the landscape, the color of the soil, the color of the rock, and the devoid of vegetation. You see how quickly it happens. And behind that is the thin blue line, that's the Dead Sea, and then the rise of the hills of Moab behind. So that line is quite visible there. You can see it here on this map as well. Here it comes, which I showed you yesterday, how the land of Judah, the heartland of Judah, you can see the eastern part of it, the southern part of it, is beyond that line. The land of promise, the heartland of the land of promise, the land where I'm taking you to live and make your home, straddles that line between the permanent agricultural land and the sheep and goat land. The sheep and goat land, here you see a bit of it. This is, again, the wet time of the year. Here you see more of the dry time of the year, at least further east and south. Yeah, that's kind of tough going. You wonder what these guys eat. A little bit of scraggly dried brush is part of the land. Here's a picture as well. That's kind of a Psalm 23 picture where the sheep are following the shepherd. They're in a field that has been harvested, a grain field. And seasonally, during the summertime when the grain is already out of the field, the shepherds are able to cross that line. It's not a barrier with a fence, right? I mean, it's just a rainfall line. And graze the stubble and fertilize the field. You have that. So the symbiosis there. You could say that because the main product of the shepherd, the main substance, the wool of the sheep is for clothing, and the hair of the goat is to make your Bedouin tent. But what do you eat? You don't want to eat your sheep and goats because then you won't have any product to make your tent or clothing anymore, right? So, except on festivals or feasts, on special days. But for the most part, your protein is milk, goat milk in particular. Half the land is a land where the main economy is summarized by a land flowing with milk. Even though it's harsh and difficult and rather sparse and scratchy land. Very much a milky land. The verse here in Deuteronomy, which again describes the land as good, speaks about also the other side of the 12-inch line, probably the side that you would prefer to live on. It says here, the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land. There's that phrase again. A land of brooks of water, fountains and springs, flowing forth in valleys and hills. There's language here that echoes what we started with last night in Deuteronomy 11. A land of wheat and barley, vines, fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil, and honey. Honey. You see there are 7 things mentioned here. Wheat, barley, vines, fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil, and honey. Yeah? These have entered into Jewish lore and Christian lore and tradition and imagery. The 7 species, each one of them ends up being used as images of fertility and all kinds of things in the biblical record. Wheat and barley are the winter crops. Vines, that's grapevines in particular. Figs, pomegranates, and olives are summer fruit, permanent plants that grow year to year, the same plant, and produce fruit in the summertime. And the odd one out here, historically, has been the last one, honey, because that's not a plant. Yeah? And so the traditional interpretation here for honey has gone different directions. And let me show you what those two are. First of all, this is here it is, a picture of high interior hill country between Jerusalem and Shechem, part of the land of Ephraim, just north of Saul's territory. And you can see the plowed fields in the bottom, dependent on rainfall, not irrigation. That makes it different from Egypt, very much so. The land here is good, but it's not very big. You see, it's small. It's small. The difference is, a billionaire and you, the largest American money that you can have, both allowed, is a $100 bill. It's just they have a lot of them. You have maybe a few less. You've got fields here. It's just not as many as Egypt. It's not nearly as much. So the population, the overall bank account, and so on is going to be more marginal and less supportive of anything larger than like a big mouse. Yeah? So anyway, you've got that at the bottom. As you go up the slope of the hill, on that right-hand side, that hill has the road circling around it, you can see cultivated areas of olive trees and grapevines and things. As you go, this land, both the hilly area and the flat land here, supports the village, the people living in the village behind. Nobody lives in the fields. There's no separate farmhouses. Everybody lives together in the village and then comes out and then back again. Out and back again. As far as you can walk for a little bit, do your work in the field, and get back the same day. That's how big the economic zone is here. Here is a better picture maybe of some terracing where the natural slope of the hill is walled off a bit, and then the soil does collect. Again, it's not nearly as big as the Nile Delta, right? But it works. And traditional methods here we have a Palestinian farmer showing our students how to plow, right? Jesus talked about plowing in a parable. And if you've never plowed behind a donkey, you haven't done much yet, right? In terms of knowing what that parable is all about. And if you look back, the plow line is going to do this, right? And so on. Wheat and barley in a valley just north of Nazareth. Vines, and the grapes are growing rather than putting them on trellises. Historically, from the time of the New Testament and before, they're simply running along the ground, and then when the grapes start to form, they're lifted up on a rock or on a twig, in this case an old tire, are lifted up, and then after you pull the grapes off, you put the vine back on the ground again to kind of pull out the moisture of the soil. We know this historically. There's a Roman text from the time of Jesus in Latin that talks about this. All right, as Jesus does in John 15 as well. Figs. There's a nice ripe one off the tree. Again, if you haven't eaten a ripe fig off a tree, directly off the tree, you haven't done much yet in life. All right, it's really nice. It really is. That would be late summer, pomegranates, and olives. And honey, most people think this, all right, the almond blossom and the honeybee. And one of the early medieval Jewish rabbis said that since honey's not a plant, it's like the product of the bee. What that means is it's a land of wildflowers as well in the springtime. And the wildflowers are tremendous in the land. Springtime, every possible color you can imagine. And you're happy, you're blessed, at least at that time of year, when the rains do come, winter into spring. But there is another plant in the land, the date palm, that is sweet as honey. In fact, the word for the date palm honey, when you squeeze the date, that sticky sweet stuff, is the same word in Hebrew and in other ancient Semitic languages as the sticky stuff that comes out of this insect. It's the same word. It's the same word. And we can track it across ancient Semitic languages. It's the same word, including modern Arabic and Hebrew. So the idea is that the honey then, the sweetest, the best of these orchard crops is the date palm. Is the date palm? Here's a date palm carved into the capital of the synagogue at Capernaum. That was not there in Jesus' day yet, but a couple hundred years after that. And the Jerusalem Talmud, a long document that explains biblical text, Pentateuch text. It's multiple volumes long. From the 5th and 6th centuries AD, when it's commenting on honey in the verse, says, oh yeah, that's dates. That's dates. The point is, then, that whether it's the sticky stuff of a bee or the sticky stuff from the date palm, it's still with all those other orchard crops and field crops, speaking about then the better watered, a little better arable land, the other half of the land of Judah, the other half of the land of promise. And that the land of the promise then, where God says to Moses, you are entering into this land, where I promised to take care of you. Remember, that was how we ended last time, the first session last time, Deuteronomy 11. It's a land where I promised, your eyes of the Lord are always on it, and so on. Is a land where I know it's going to be, half of the land is going to be really tough. It's going to be really tough, and half of the land is going to be pretty good. And I'm intentionally bringing you into that. Remember, I showed you the one map. Let me back it all the way up here. This one. There it is, that one. All right? That shows the heartland of Israel and its mousy neighbors. And the land of Judah, the chosen one, the land of milk and honey one in particular, is the one that is least advantaged, both in terms of being connected to the international trade route. To benefit from that, there isn't one going through Judah unless you expand your territory, and it's half wilderness. And you have to ask then, how come of all the places Moses could have taken Israel, it was here? Is that intentional? I think it is. That God then is bringing Israel into a place that is intentionally not always totally materially wonderful. But when it's rough times, we'll still take care of you. And that's more of a lesson of life, I think, of real life than it would be otherwise. Yes? Yeah. In both cases, it's even the fruit. I mean, it needs to be cared and pruned and tended and all of this, as opposed to whatever would happen to grow wild. There is effort involved, and that's part actually that's not unrelated to the curse in Genesis 3, that the land is going to have thorns and thistles, and there's more thorns and thistles than anything else actually that grow naturally in the land. So that's accurate for this land as well, and it's going to be by the sweat of your brow. So it is consistent. This land is also consistent with the curse. But there's also enough here that says, but it can be redeemed. It can be redeemed. I mentioned last time that we need to listen to the geographical voice in the story, and that the biblical writers consider the land to be a character in the story, in some way, a character in the story. And they also will see kind of a mirror image. What is the quality of the land? What is the quality of people? And the one actually mirrors the other. Where we know enough about real life to know what real life is like. And I'm guessing, Chris, I know as much about your congregation as I can see in front of me, all right? But I'm guessing that at any given Sunday, half of the congregation, half of the people who show up, just spend a week wandering in the wilderness looking for scrappy stuff to survive for another day or two, kind of the land of the sheep and goat, where you really have to depend, and half say, what's the problem? I mean, the harvest was good this year, and the stocks helped me, and life is good. That's more the land of honey. But the next week, maybe some of the people on the one side have moved to the other side already, just depending on the situation of it. And Moses knows that. He knows that. And so he's trying to describe something that is realistic, not only to the physical landscape where everybody is going, but what he knows about real life. I think so. We want to make it, crystal cathedrals and health and wealth. That's what we want to do. And there are churches you can go to, actually, that are very, very vocal in that sense. Some of them have TV ministries, There are. But I think it's a misreading. I think in most parts of the world, this verse can be understood a little bit more immediately than it can in most parts of North America. So, okay. All right. Let's jump a bit. Yesterday I mentioned read the land, then see the text, and then live the book. And yesterday I gave you a couple of examples of how we can look at the landscape, start to become fluent in looking at it, reading it in a large way with bigger issues. Today I'm going to sort of add to that, but also look at some texts specifically so that we can see them perhaps a little bit better. One of them has to do with the Patriarchs, Genesis. This is a picture from actually it first showed up in National Geographic magazine, and then in the 60s, the National Geographic put together a thick book on everyday life in Bible times, just taking all of their pictures and articles that they had published before. Can you imagine that? The society would not do that nowadays, but back then they did. And this is one of the pictures that they showed. The first one on Abraham, some Isaac maybe we'll get to Jacob. And then the second session, wilderness Psalms, how to look at what I call a wilderness paradox. This south and east, kind of below the 12-inch line, where life is hard, but what else happens there? So this is a picture that we sometimes have, even though you might not have seen this particular one before, but a kind of an ordered parade. There you go, even more ordered than Canal Day parades, right? An ordered parade of Abraham there, sort of the kind of the tallest and buffiest of all the guys kind of coming into the land here, and his father, the Terah, on his right, Sarah behind on the donkey, and looking a bit demurred, yep, and then the whole flock of servants and sheep and goats behind, all just looking for that land with the gaze in their eyes. And this is a picture that I think a lot of us have in our minds. I think it's a bit more idealized than real, but it's maybe a place to begin. The title here, Fidelity and Realpolitik. Fidelity is a word that means faithful, being loyal, being committed, devoted, being helpful no matter what, committed no matter what, and that's good stuff. The word realpolitik, that's a word that sort of became famous in America when Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State. This was a long time ago. Not so long, he's still alive, but a long time ago. The fellow who went to China when Nixon opened up China. And basically it's, we do what's most expedient to help us today. It's basically what it means. Whatever is necessary or expedient to meet a goal is what he said. And it's more of a make it work for you and your team, which is a word that is very useful in big business or other organization politics, It's a big word, and so on. Whatever is necessary to meet a goal. Morality is a second issue in Realpolitik. It's a primary issue in Fidelity. The two of them, I think, were active in the lives of the patriarchs, to be quite honest. And we'll see. I mentioned already the land is kind of scrappy, so are they. There's some dysfunction going on in the patriarchal narratives and in family life. And I'll just mention maybe some larger issues around that. First of all, Genesis. Genesis is a book of beginnings. That's what the word means. Explanations. How the world came to be. The beginning of people, the beginning of human institutions. Music, craftsmen, and cities are all mentioned early on in Genesis. It's the beginning of people groups, of nations. We see the beginning of people's response to God, if you want, of religion, of a divine covenant that God makes with Abraham and others. It's a book of what's wrong with the world and what's right with the world, and sort of where did that all come from, but also a book of hope and promise and redemption. So it's a good way to begin, both Bible and maybe our understanding of the people of the Bible. There are many themes in the book of Genesis. The theme of promise and fulfillment, the theme of trust, the theme of covenant, the theme of creation, also the theme of the heart's going to do what the heart wants to do. That's also there. And they're all sort of mixed together, jumbled up together. The explanations for these themes are not given in the form of philosophical essays or theological reasonings and treatises, but simply they're given or we see them through stories of people. Through stories of people, seeing how people actually live, both wrongly and rightly. And I read the book of Genesis not so much as usually it shows up as part of in our sort of organizational scheme of what kind of literature we have in the Old Testament as legal material, because it ends up as Exodus, and the storyline ends up in the book of Exodus and Leviticus, and all of that is a bunch of legal stuff. Or as history book. Both of those are true, but I subsume both of those under the title wisdom literature. Wisdom, I mentioned yesterday, is skill in living. Skill in living on every level. That's the definition of the late Dr. Elmer Martin. It's a Mennonite professor at Fresno Seminary in California. Skill in living. How do we live rightly? And one thing that helps us learn how to live rightly is to read stories about people who struggle with that issue and maybe didn't always hit it right. And the patriarchs are certainly some of those. Certainly some of those. The stories then of the patriarchs, of the ancestors of ancient Israel, become reflections of the nation of Israel. Jacob's name was changed to Israel, Genesis chapter 32. He's not only the ancestor of, in terms of bloodline, but in terms of action and behavior. And I think the biblical writers are very aware of that as Israel becomes a nation, they sort of act like their ancestors acted in many ways. But also, the patriarchs reflect everybody, not just the ancient Israelites. Everybody, people who do the best they can, but in the end know that they need help and they need salvation in the end. So you sort of see that as the story unfolds. Should we assume that God chose Abraham and his family because Abraham lived in the very best of all cultures? And for us to live biblically, we should replicate the lifestyle that Abraham had? or the culture that Abraham was living in? I think not. I think not. Should we assume that you sort of tribal semi-nomadism, is or why else then did God choose Abraham and bring him to the land that he did? Yeah. For sure, the land, let me see the next slide here. Yeah, the land and the time, a place where the give and take of fidelity and the morality and the faith that it ensues, and but just make it work as it's best for me, realpolitik was strong. That tug was strong. And the themes here, the heart's going to do what the heart's going to do, or choosing the weak to shame the strong, we mentioned that last time, and the need to redeem the times. It's very strong in the book of Genesis. Very strong in the book of Genesis. The people in the land, I think both. I think both. I think, by the way, this is an aside, I think there's a lot of people today who would say that, well, the Bible, that's old. It happened a long time ago, a long way away. It's all outdated. It's all not real anymore, not relevant for life anymore. It has, things to say that just don't work anymore. I think the reason a lot of folks say that is not because they really believe that, but because if you believe that the Bible is relevant and that the way that people behaved then is the way people behave today still, yeah, then we're also subject to its claims on our life. And we don't want to be subject to its claims on our lives. And so we'll say it's outdated. The problem is it's too relevant. We can see each other too closely. That's the problem. Well, it's not the problem. It's the way it is. Yeah. So Genesis then portrays the ancestors of Israel, the people, as semi-nomadic pastoralists. How do you like that phrase? All right, what does that mean? Let me read the slide here. Israel's origins were in this marginal steppe land, this grazing land, this seam between the arable lands and the flat-out open desert where nobody can be. All right, semi-nomadic pastoralists, primarily being shepherds of sheep and goats. Abraham was such a person. For 40 years, Moses was such a person after he left Egypt and before he went back to bring Israel out. He was a shepherd out in this marginal land. And the Bible writers were then very careful to say that during that last 40 years of his life, when he was bringing Israel out to the land of promise, he was shepherding his people. It uses that same language. Shepherding his people. David, of course, also a shepherd. It's hard to find three people in the Old Testament that are more foundational than Abraham, Moses, and David. All of them are shepherds. All of them. So there's something about being in that landscape that is, I don't know, especially conducive to developing skills of life that can survive and allow folks to manage in a good way. I want to start here with Abraham, Genesis 11, 31 to 12, verse 10. Let me read some of that here. Genesis 11:31. Terah took Abram his son, Lot the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldees. in order to enter the land of Canaan, and they went as far as Haran. They settled there for a while. And the days of Terah were 205. Terah died in Haran. Then the Lord said to Abram, leave your country, where you are now, your relatives, your father's house, to the land that I will show you. Notice he doesn't mention what land that is. Just go to the place I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. You will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. The one who curses you, I will curse. In you all the families of the earth will be blessed. Abram goes forth. He comes in verse 5 to the land of Canaan. In verse 6, he goes through the land as far as Shechem to a place called the Oak of Moreh. In verse 7, God promises in the land. And so he builds an altar to the Lord there. He builds a stone altar outside of Shechem. And then in verse 8, he does the same thing in Bethel. And then in verse 9, he continues on toward the south, toward the Negev. And then there's a famine, and he goes to Egypt. All right, I summarized some of that. This is the map we can start with. It's a large map of the eastern side of that big map I started with yesterday, the world of the Old Testament. I don't know if this one is in your book. Is it in there or not? I don't know if I put it in or not. I don't know. And I've marked here some places in the story. But once again, notice the color. The green is above that 12-inch rainfall line. That's the arable land, or mountainous land, good rainfall. The yellow is the open desert. And the orange is kind of that in-between land. That in-between land, it's not so bad that people can't live there, but it's not the good stuff either. That in-between seam, we saw it running through the land of Judah on the other map. I'm showing you here Ur of the Chaldees, where Abraham left from. He went up the Euphrates River toward its source. That's the navigable of the rivers of Mesopotamia. A lot of life along it. He ends up in a place called Haran, today southern Turkey, right where Turkey and Syria and Iraq kind of come together. Haran is a word that means crossroads. So we know it was a busy commercial center as well. Abraham lives there for a while, settles down there for a while. Then he makes his way down to Canaan and eventually down to Egypt. Abraham goes from one end of the Fertile Crescent to the other. From one land of empire building to the other. And notice, even though life is really good in terms of criteria of whatever, in both Mesopotamia and Egypt in the day, Abraham was not home in either one. He was called to live in this land between, this land of Canaan instead. That X there, that red X, I put that there just for you. The name of that site, that red X, you can see that was on Abraham's route. Right on that seam where the shepherds are still able to go before the open desert. The name of that site is Palmyra. All right? Palmyra. Okay. That's the Greek name. The Old Semitic name was Tadmor, but Palmyra. You know, for millennia, this is a pattern that we can track thousands of years. For millennia, large extended families, if you want, you can call them tribes or clans, people related by blood, large family, extended families of these sheep and goat lifestyle people, these pastoralists. They're grazing. Semi-nomadic means they're following the seasons. They're following the rainfall patterns and where the grass is going to grow. Herders of sheep and goats and cattle, linked along family lines, have inhabited this thin band, mostly that band of darker orange just south of the green band. That thin band. The upper part of it, 14 inches or more, strong enough for grain without irrigation, permanent settlement. But that semi-arid kind of steppe land is where you find these folks. They follow the rainfall, moving sometimes a long distance in search of grass, sometimes not so much. Most of them tended to stay within limits of broadly defined patterns of movement. Right? This movement of Abraham, the entire length would have been more unusual than not. They ended up getting to know or connecting with towns that were right on the edge, right where the green meets the orange. Usually, when we use the word port, we think about cities right on the seacoast, like in New York or Seattle or Los Angeles or something. A port where the big shipping can come in. But cities or towns or villages that were on the edge of the open desert were also port cities. It's just that instead of trading with foreigners who came in on ships, they traded with foreigners who came in on camels. Still long distance trade. So you have that dynamic going on here. These towns were profitable and worth getting to know and getting to be connected with. So the sheep and goat people who moved, following the grass, to their advantage would want to somehow join up with some of these town folk in, we'd say, reciprocal, or if you want a more fancy word, symbiotic, helpful relationships, where the people living in the town could then provide help in time of famine. If the weather pattern is really bad and you can't make it with your sheep and goats, you come into the town that you know and maybe can graze in their fields or trade some of your sheep wool for enough grain to eat and manage. And the people who are the shepherds, who know the desert, can provide as well certain kinds of products, but mostly they can provide protection. Because these towns on the, think ports again, ports on the open ocean, on the seashore. There's great opportunity when the shipping lanes work, but sometimes those shipping lanes are actually pirates or Vikings or whatever who are coming to, destroy and take and then sail away, and you can't chase them because you don't have a boat. The same thing happens on the desert, where these camel raiders come in and then take whatever they can and then disappear out into the desert. There's nothing you can do about it. So you want a friendly sheep and goat guy who sort of knows how to chase them down on your side. So these helpful relationships can develop. Helpful relationships. Market towns and so on that have a need and you can benefit from. Now, this is a pattern of movement that we can see historically forever along this line. And I think that it's fair to then read the Abraham story, the Isaac story, the Jacob story, in light of that kind of a pattern. Because we have in Genesis 12, as an example, Abraham then coming into the land and interfacing with some of these towns on the edge. A Shechem, a Bethel, eventually a Gerar, and so on, where he has interactions with them. Settles up a little bit outside of town on the desert end and interacts. I'll get to that a little bit more in a minute. This is more of a terrain map that shows the same. You can see again the Saudi Peninsula more harsh and that trade route coming through. To summarize here, semi-nomadic, symbiotic or relational. There's mutual provision and protection between the two of them. And by interfacing with a number of border towns on this seam in particular, and this is where we don't find Abraham deep into the settled territory. We only find him on the edge. Only on the edge. So he has to develop these skills, these skills of loyalty and covenant, but also there's enough, but let me make it work for me, going on. These border towns on the scene between the steppe and arable lands, and Abraham maximizes his options. Now, embedded with all of this, a couple of more things I need to say about values, powerful values. The two most powerful values through here, in the biblical period, especially in the patriarchal period, were family and land. Family and land. By family, when I say values, I mean where your identity is formed and shaped. What you kind of keep coming back to find out who you are and where you're going. By family, we mean nested circles. That is to say, nested circles of relationship based on blood ties. The basic unit is called the father's house. That's the English. The Hebrew is Beit Av, father's house. The basic living unit, it's 3 to 4 generations of people living in the same structure, whether it's a Bedouin tent or when they do settle up, a small little housing unit. Economically self-sufficient, as big as it needs to be to feed and protect itself. That's why you need lots of kids. The more the better. And you know where you belong, right? You know where you belong. We have, for instance, at the end of the book of Job, the end of the book of Job, the very last verse of the book of Job. Job is a fellow who went through some rather tough times. He spent a lot of time in that desert land, you might say. He himself was a guy who was a sort of a tent dweller on the scene here. In the very last verse of the book of Job, Job lived a long time, 140 years, saw his sons, grandsons, 4 generations. And he died an old man full of days. And that's kind of the ideal of what everybody aspired to. That 4-generation package that keeps moving through time. We haven't actually that 4-generation unit that was critical as the basic living unit of the time of the Old Testament become a theological reality actually in the church. Here's how it happens in Psalm 78, first of all. Psalm 78. Verse 5 and following. He, God, established a testimony in Jacob, that is to say, among the people of Israel, which he commanded to our fathers, that they should teach them to their children, that the generation to come might know, yet even the children not yet born. That's 4 generations. And so it operates not just on sort of bloodline economy, but on teaching and inculcating the values of the family, which here are embodied in the Torah, the instructions that God gave with Moses. And how does it end up in the church? 2 Timothy, some of you can maybe even quote this one. I'll read it so I don't mess it up. 2 Timothy 2:2. What does Paul say to Timothy? The things that you have heard from me, in the presence of many witnesses, entrust them to faithful men that they can teach others also, for generations. What you have heard from me, teach to others that they can teach to others yet, for generations. So it's the basic unit that is very operative in terms of value in life, beyond that, when you have multiple families, together they can, when they do settle down in a village, they all share the same well, they'll sometimes share the same fields. Eventually, beyond that, you'll have a number of villages, of clans, forming the same tribe, and the loyalties are there as well, and then eventually the kingdom under David, and all of that is subsumed under the kingdom of God. And the language keeps bumping up in level, where David is not only king, he's father of the people of Israel, and God is not only God, he's not only king, but he's also father. That's a common term for God. And it goes all the way back to the role of the patriarch, to provide for and protect and care for and inculcate the values and so on. It's not a sexist term. It's a real term that has to do with how the family and the values were shaped in the Old Testament. So before we change things in some Bibles and preaching, we should understand what it actually meant to begin with, right? Read the past first as you go. I actually think that the language that speaks of God as Father is stronger than the language that speaks of God as King, because of the word King operates later in Israel's history. It's kind of this later term that developed that overarches all of the tribes, but at the core, the one that really started it off was the Father's house. Land as a basic value as well. Ownership is not defined by money paid for title deeds, although that did happen. But especially with these patriarchs who are kind of moving and looking for grazing land, ownership, quote unquote, was more defined by the right to use. The right to use. The only land that Abraham ever bought was that burial plot for Sarah and then eventually himself in Hebron. He negotiated the settlement to buy the land at one of these border towns, Hebron, where the land very quickly gives way to this open grazing land. It was a transaction that was helpful for both parties, as we've already suggested. Well, here's an example of a father's house. You can see a rocky cliffside with natural caves at the top of the picture. Natural caves. At the bottom, you can see a house where they've simply walled in the front of the cave and put in a doorway. People still living in this kind of environment, not so much in Israel, but in areas around Sinai and South Jordan and places. And so you do have these units. It's just sort of living in and part of off the land. But the Abraham story perhaps is more seen with the Bedouin tent instead. Your connection to place is immediate and obvious, whether it's in the cave house or whether it's in the Bedouin tent. People are conceived literally on the ground. You are born on the ground, you eat on the ground, you sleep on the ground, you die on the ground, you're buried in the ground. It's very, very earthy in that sense. Very earthy. And Abraham, we picture him in the tent, and we know in Genesis 15, when he gets back up into the land of Canaan, I think there's a parade here. We can look and see if Abraham is at the front, yeah? At the front. At one point in Genesis 15, God says to Abraham, Genesis 15, as the covenant is being made with him first, he's in the tent. Chapter 5, go outside and look toward the heavens and count the stars. Yeah? Go outside and count the stars. See how many stars you see outside. That's how many your descendants will be. Now, what's interesting is that the tent, the Bedouin tent, which is goat hair, woven, you can cut it with a knife easily. Yeah? But nobody does, because the cultural value is that if you are living in the tent, even though one half of it is open to open air, and it flaps in the wind and very thin, you can hear through very easy. But if you're living in the tent, nobody can touch you. You're under the provision of the patriarch. You're perfectly safe. You can fear nothing when you're in the tent. And that that Isaiah, living much, much later in Jerusalem, when he's describing creation, in Isaiah chapter 40, and the relationship between God who created and people, he says this, Isaiah chapter 40, verse 22, verse 21, "Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been declared to you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? From the beginning of creation, haven't you understood that it is he who sits above the circle of the earth, above the arc of the sky? The inhabitants down here were like grasshoppers. It is he who, God, stretched out the heavens like a curtain, that arc of the sky. Stretched it out like a curtain." The verb here, stretched out, is the same verb used when a Bedouin pitches the tent, stretches out the cloth and puts up the tent. It is he who spreads them out, the arc of the heavens, like a tent to dwell in. So when God then said to Abraham, "Go out of your tent and look up at that ark and see the sky," that was at nighttime. But in the daytime, when Abraham is in the tent, because it's so hot, you want to have a bit of shade in the tent, and he looks up through the tent, through the dark tent. That's the inside of the tent in daytime looking up. And it needs to be darker in the room to really understand this. But there's 1,000 little points of light. It's like the nighttime sky. It's like the nighttime sky. That arc that you're living under of protection. The patriarch's job, provide for and protect family and land. The two greatest values. As God's job description, quote unquote, was the same for people. Remember we said the Egyptian deities didn't do that very well. But the land that you were entering to possess is a land of hills and valleys. The eyes of the Lord your God are always upon it. A land that the Lord your God cares for. And these are things that can be understood, appreciated, seen, especially on this arable scene. This scene between the arable land and the open desert. So much. All of this nested under what we typically talk about when we talk about Abraham. That is to say, a strong belief in the divine force, the force of God, who created and made and controls as well. Especially important given the harsh realities that people were facing. Well, in Genesis 12, I read, God is asking Abraham to give up what? Leave your country, leave your relatives, leave your father's house, leave your Beit. The greatest values that you think that you have, leave them both. Leave the place that you know and leave the people that you know. And go. And it's a massively countercultural thing to do that. And we have to assume that Abraham leaves with both faith, but also skills that he's developed. Faith in God, fidelity in God, but also skills that he's developed to know how to survive. Do you know that in the early days, we think about the monasteries in the desert, where the monks would live all their life out in the desert, and all these stories we have about how there are, 5 years of probationary period to see if they're worthy of joining the monkhood, right? These stories that you hear. Where the one guy was in where you couldn't speak at all except once a year. You could say 2 words to the superior. And so the guy came in after 1 year and he said, "Food cold." And okay. And the next year he came in and said, a year later, he said, "Bed hard." And then the third year came in and he said, "I quit." And the head monk said, "No wonder all you ever do is complain," right? The reason there's this probation partly is to see if these folks are tough enough to live out there. And Abraham, he had to be tough enough. He had to be tough enough. And so when we read here, for instance, here in this, I'll show you another picture, in this, here it is, this land, he's more or less following this 12-inch line as he's coming down into the land, Shechem, Bethel, Jerusalem, eventually down toward Beersheba and Gerar. As he's making his way down, first place he ends up here is between Mount Ebal and Gerizim at a place called Shechem. Here's an aerial view a long time ago of Shechem. Here's an aerial view today. It's that circle in the middle between the, whoops, that's the aerial view. This is, one more, Chris. One more, that one. That's it's not, that's from the top of Mount Gerizim, looking straight down. I'll take you there. All right, and we can, I'll let you take your own picture. I'll take you there. And Shechem is that bare spot in the middle. And when Abraham gets there, Shechem, next picture, is a city with a very strong wall, well fortified. You can see remains of it here. That has, next picture is remains of a gate, very strong gate complex. Whoops, that one. Strong gate complex, an inner and an outer gate, left and right. And it has on the next picture remains of what was a strong temple tower. And so they had established economic and political and military and religious life here in Shechem, all Canaanite pagan. But it was here. And Abraham, what does he do when he gets? It doesn't say he goes in Shechem, verse 6. He goes to the oak of Moreh, outside basically, to the side of Shechem, actually to the oak of Moreh. That's a place outside of Shechem. And what does he do? After God appears to him, he builds an altar, almost certainly of stone, permanent. It's going to be there. And what possible right does Abraham have from the point of view of the people living in Shechem? I'm not talking about what God said to him. What do the people of Shechem think about this? This is their place. And here comes this stranger coming in, actually putting up a permanent spot, sanctuary, which they know good and well he's going to keep coming back to. And I think that we have to assume that they have Abraham. It's not mentioned here because it just happens that Abraham enters into one of these relationships where he's able to come back in times of famine or need, and they can help each other, provide for, protect for each other. He goes south to Bethel. He does the same thing there. He goes eventually to a place called Gerar and does the same thing there before he settles up permanently in a town called Beersheba, which is not a town yet. It's simply an encampment. But he has this dynamic that he develops that allows him to actually live in the land and have help when he needs it. The big story about that is, let me skip, eventually he goes down here to the Negev. One more. Oh, whoops. It should be one more, Chris. One more. You're going the wrong way. Whoops. The other direction. One more. More. Again. There. Okay. Here. He ends up in the Negev. He ends up in the Negev, which means basically dry land. All right? And you can see kind of what it looks like today with these small little encampments. Again, Bedouin encampments today. Ends up in the dry land where he plants a tree, digs a well, and says, this is going to be life. This is going to be life. I think we can sort of sense, we can kind of read it that direction. Now, to be very quick, I want to end by 10:30 here. All right? And we can take a break. When we get to the Isaac story, see what happens in this way of life based on these family relationships all living together in the same living space is that we have then the authority passed on like the royal line in England, right? It's passed on to the oldest child. Except here it's like it used to be in England. It had to be, unless there were absolutely no males, it had to be a male. So you could find one somewhere. But that's now changed legally in England. So you can have a queen more often. But anyway, here it always goes to the oldest male. The oldest male that the father designates. And Abraham says, well, Ishmael, he's kicked out of the Beit Av and has to go found his own. And Isaac is the one of choice. And so what Isaac, among other things, has to do is he's going to now reestablish these kinds of rights that Abraham already had established. And I want to jump to Genesis chapter 26. Genesis chapter 26. In chapter 20 of Genesis, let me start here. In chapter 20 of Genesis, already Abraham, he's out in the Negev. He's settling between a place called Kadesh and Shur. He sojourns for a while in Gerar. These are place names that are mentioned. If you put them on a map, you can see that he's either going deep into the desert area or back up toward that settled area. And I think it depends on the time of year. Again, it doesn't have to say that because that's what people do. So in the summertime, in the wintertime, when it does rain a little bit out in the desert, he encamps out there. That's when the crops are in the field. And in the summertime then, when the crops are harvested in the field and it dries up in the desert, then he'll move up closer to these cities and towns. It's kind of a pattern that you see, following the seasons, following the grass. So then he sojourns in Gerar, and when he's in Gerar, a city-state, I'll show you on the map in a minute where it is, he ends up making a covenant with the king of Gerar, a guy named Abimelech. They make a formal covenant, kind of seal the deal, make a formal treaty. And you can read the terms of the treaty, where they're going to help each other and so on. I think we can assume that happened earlier at Shechem and Bethel, but we just didn't have to hear about it because it wasn't part of the bigger story that the writer is telling us. But anyway, he digs some wells and he establishes rights. Then he dies. Isaac now takes over the patriarchy. He's now the head of the father's house. We've bumped down one generation, right? More kids are born. Still 4 generations probably. And there's a famine in the land, and when there's a famine, it means out in the grazing land, which is now becoming more open desert. What do you do in order to find a place to actually water your flocks and live? You move closer to the arable land, closer to these towns that they're kind of expecting you to come because you've made that relationship already. So Abraham did that in Gerar. And we read here in chapter 26, there was a famine in the land besides the previous one where Abraham went to Gerar and Isaac goes there. Now God says, don't go down to Egypt. We've got that relationship in Gerar. Go back to Gerar. And so we read in verse 6, Isaac lived in Gerar, actually lived there, put down roots for a while. Verse 12 of Genesis 26, look what he's doing. He's sowing seed. He's staying there for a while, actually. The famine is lasting more than a year. So put down seed a bit. And then he settles in verse 17, camps in the valley around Gerar, settles there, and he's sort of moving from this semi-nomadic to a permanent lifestyle now that he's up close. And of course, the people of Gerar say, wait a minute, we don't have, I can feed you once, but I can't feed you forever, is basically what they're saying. And so, verse 18, Isaac digs wells. We read, dig wells to say, I'm going to claim this area. The same one that his father had dug before they were stopped up. The same ones, and he's reclaiming them, and now there's fights between the herdsmen. The ones of Gerar and Isaac's herdsmen, and they fight, and Isaac says, okay. And he moves a little bit out toward the desert and digs some more wells, and the local people of Gerar say, wait, that's not far enough. We're still going to fight you. And then eventually, you see, in verse 23, he goes out to Beersheba, where Abraham had put his tamarisk tree and well, and says, is this far enough away? And now they renew the covenant. The rest of the chapter, they renew that same covenant. Abimelech is still king. So he remembers. And now the relationship is now renewed and becomes helpful between the two. Let me show you on a map how that works. All right, let's look at actually a map. And here, when I sent the map to Chris, I goofed up a bit. Those yellow things are out of place. You see those two yellow splotches, that yellow highlighter in both cases? Actually, both of them go up a little bit to the first town. That one should be on Beersheba, the other one should be on Gerar. Just go straight up. And you can see those two towns directly north. Can you read it okay? Beersheba and Gerar, can you see it on the map? Just go straight up a little bit. That's where it should be. The Negev, where they're living, is an area on that seam. If you look here at this map, and this one is now correct, the one on Beersheba, the other one on, or close to Gerar at least, close to Gerar, and I drew a green line between them. Do you see that green line? That green line basically demarcates that 12-inch rainfall line. So Gerar is above it. That's it, the settled town. Beersheba is below it. That's not a town. That's just a tent and a tree and a well. It's not a real town yet. But what you can notice here is that now you see the blue lines kind of stretching away to the left are water flow lines. Blue is water. Can you make that out on the map? Blue is water. And what you can see is that Gerar, where Isaac goes and actually, in the time of famine, and that digs the wells and wants to stay, Gerar is fed by its own water source, water table, valley that has water flowing in. And Beersheba is on another one, another channel. You see that? They're not rivers, but they're seasonal flows. And underneath are different water tables. So that when Isaac finally says, okay, I'm in Beersheba, is that far enough? The shepherds know you're over the hill, you're in a different water flow, digging a different water table. Now it's enough. You're not sharing our resources. You're not taking our resources. Until there's famine, then you can come back. But you're in a separate geographical zone. That's your set of resources. This is our set. All right? And Isaac says, okay, we'll make a covenant, and I may be back, but as long as life is good, we can do it there. This is a picture of Gerar, the mound today unexcavated, a little bit excavated. You can see here it is in the distance there with the trees on top and the wheat fields around it. Here you can see today with modern irrigation, you can actually get about the same yield per acre that we read Isaac did in the land. But there are still, this is looking from the top of Gerar down, Bedouin who pitch their tents and make use of the fields during the summertime when the crops are out of the fields. Isaac didn't have this irrigation, even though he got about the same yield, so it was blessed years with a lot of grain. You can see, isn't that great? And eventually they all ended up, Isaac, like Abraham, in Beersheba. Eventually a city is built there. Eventually this becomes the southern town of ancient Israel, and this is a well, might or may not be the same one, on the other side of the 12-inch line. On the other side of the 12-inch line. Okay. Now that's maybe a lot of detail that you didn't expect to start off. But I want to give you an example where the narrative line in the Bible, the actual storyline of the Bible, the details that the writer is telling us, he's not telling us everything there is to know. That would be too thick of a book. At the end of the Gospel of John, we read if John would have written everything Jesus did, there's not enough books to hold all of the stories, right? And I think we have to assume the same thing with with all of this. That there are aspects of life that are just known. They're just done. And so when you write the story, you're going to write it telling the details that you want to tell about how God is helping Abraham through, and so on. But you don't have to tell a lot of the other stuff because people just know it. That's just part of life. But you need to make sure that when you tell the story the way you're telling it, you're not making it up. It fits the real life that's there. And the real life that's there fits it. Does that make sense? They have to fit. They have to fit. You can't have Abraham, you can't have the writer here say, when Isaac sowed seed, he used the gasoline power generator to irrigate the land. Everybody would say, wait a minute, that the story must be false because they didn't have that back then, right? It doesn't have those kinds of, it only has the details that resonate with what life was really like, based on the culture and the landscape and the actual land itself can give you. Now, we don't have time to sort of run through some of the Jacob story. That's kind of the famous line about how he, let me jump to this one, how this is a statue in the facade of the cathedral in Milan, Italy. Jacob's ladder, you know the story, right? Where he has the dream and God promises that I'll be with you and keep you on the journey that you go and bring you back into this land. And then eventually how Jacob does come back and he wrestles with this fellow in the Jabbok River. This is Genesis 32. And his name is changed to Israel, and so on. Eventually he meets Esau, the brother that he had cheated, and they become reconciled. All of this is there. The interesting line, let me jump, this is more Isaac stuff here. Let me jump all the way here to Jeremiah chapter 17. Very late in the history of ancient Israel, the Old Testament history, Jeremiah. Babylon is at the gates, ready to bust in town. Nebuchadnezzar is coming, right? And going to destroy Jerusalem and take the people into exile. And Jeremiah knows that. Jeremiah, the prophet living in Jerusalem, is commenting on the times. And he's saying that God is allowing this to happen because we've let our fathers' homes, we've let our clans, we've let our families, we've let our villages, we've let our towns, we've let our tribes, we've let our nation become corrupt. All the way from the bottom up, inside out. People didn't want to hear that. They didn't want to hear that. And so Jeremiah explains it this way. Let me read 5 through 10 in Jeremiah 17. 5 through 10 of Jeremiah 17. Jeremiah says this. Jeremiah is a fellow who was born and raised right on the seam, exactly on the seam between arable land and desert land, a town called Anatoth, where every morning when he woke up, he looked out into the Judean wilderness to this chasm of the land of the shepherd. And behind him was the Mount of Olives and then Jerusalem and the settled land. He was exactly on the seam when he grew up. And so he describes people like each. And he says in verse 5, thus says the Lord. The Lord says, cursed are people who simply trust in each other, make their own flesh their strength, whose heart turns away from the Lord. What are they like? Verse 6, like the bush in the desert. Won't see when prosperity comes. Will live in the stony wasteland of the wilderness, a salt land without inhabitant. Right? You can manage it out there, but life is going to be pretty tough. But, verse 7, blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord. What's he going to be like? He or she going to be like? Like a tree planted by the water. Planted by the water. Even if you're out in the wasteland. planted by the water, extending its roots by the stream. It won't fear when the heat comes. Its leaves will be green. It won't be anxious in drought years or ever cease to bear fruit. By the water. Right? Great image of a reality. And then Jeremiah brings it home. He says in the next verse, but the heart, he's talking about the landscape, and now he's going to talk about the heart. He uses the land to talk about the people. But the heart is more deceitful than anything else and desperately sick. Who can understand it? What does that have to do with the previous verse? The heart is more, the word deceitful is the same word that we get the word Jacob from. It's the same word. The word Jacob is a personal name, but it comes from a noun that means heel. And it comes from the verb that means to grab at the heel to try to supplant or trick. To use realpolitik to get ahead. That's the word Jacob. That's the ancestor who gave birth to the tribes who became Israel. Jacob had his name changed to Israel, one who strives with God. And here, Jeremiah is basically saying, the heart, you are more like Jacob than you can possibly imagine, all of you. That's what he's saying. More like Isaac, more like Abraham than you can possibly imagine. Desperately sick. Who can understand that? Yeah. I, the Lord, search the heart, test the mind, and I'm going to give you according to your ways. That's the bad news. The good news is, I'll also then change your heart. That's later in Jeremiah. Change your heart so that you can be the tree planted by the water. And that's the good news as well. So this interplay, you see, between what real human life is and the landscape, which is by choice of God, created to be both, and people brought to the land to be both, so they can understand in a very tangible, physical way what human life actually is. And the prophets can help them understand that. This is some of the interplay, where if we start to read the land, we can see the text in ways we maybe haven't seen them before. We're going to give you a break, and after the break, we'll come back and look at a paradox of wilderness, because I've been focusing mostly on the toughness of the land. So I want to sort of add to that a little bit, and we'll look at some wilderness things in the Psalms and other poetic passages. Then you can have lunch and scoot.